takie miejsce, taki kraj, nad pastwiskami ciągnący dym, wierzby jak mary w welonach mgły, tu krzyż przydrożny, tam święty gaj, jest takie miejsce, taki kraj. Kto tutaj zechce w rozpaczy tkwić, załamać ręce, płakać i pić, ten święte prawo ma bez dwóch zdań, jest takie miejsce.
So welcome again, and please everyone have a seat and enjoy yourself. But the bathrooms, if you go out this door, they're to the right. There's food in the back. It's very informal if you'd like to get up and get something, and there's water and so forth. So thank you again for coming. I want to introduce just briefly, we have one board member here tonight, Zosia Wadak. And Zosia, where are you?
Right here.
Oh. That's okay, that's okay. Zosia has been on our board for a very long time, and we appreciate all the work she does. And she does that a lot with, along with her better half, Andy Wadak, that's in the back of the room, so we always appreciate him. Stella was here, but she had a meeting with Friends of Polish Art tonight, so she was doing double duty. I'd also like to introduce, oh, there's Stella. Yay, Stella. Take a bow. Take a bow. We said all kinds of really nice things about you, and we missed Stella, too, is very involved with our activities at the Institute, and she participates with Hamtramck Drug-Free Coalition, Community Coalition, that is a program of Piast, and we do marvelous things in the community for a drug-free society, which we all know. We do a lot of mental health, kind of social service type of things, and Narcan training, and we work with our youth. We have junior coalitions, and Ms. Violet KIRCHNER, who is in the back of the room, say hi. She's a teacher at Hamtramck, and she works very closely with us with our drug program and with her kiddos, and has for a long time. And Violet is the first employee of Piast, first paid employee of the Piast Institute. There were many of us that weren't paid, but Violetta was one of the first, so we appreciate her. And then I just would like to introduce staff that's here today, who play a really important role. And most people think we have 30, 35 employees. We have 11. And it's a miracle what we do and how we do it, but we're very, very efficient at the Institute. You want something done, you go to this group. I'd like to introduce Michelle Jabina, who's on the registration table. And she's one of our newest employees and works on our communications. Because we have so many events that we actually need someone to do the press releases and communications. Frankie, who's in the back of the room, which is our high school intern, and he works with us every day after school and all summer long, so we appreciate him. We couldn't do it without him. And Robin Coyle, who's our longest employee, current employee, 18 years, 15, 17, whatever it is, she's been there a long time. And Magusha Tulecki, who has been with us since she's been 15, and she's now, are you?
Let's not do the math.
Are you 40? No. And Magusha's been with us since she was a high school person and came as a volunteer because we needed a decoy for our drug program, and we needed a minor to be able to do that. So she came to us as a minor, and now she's a major. And then Fran Foote is here, and Fran is Also, Dr. Thaddeus Radulowski's sister, and joined us years ago. I don't even know how many years.
10.
Is it 10? So 10 years. And she works with us and does marvelous things, so we appreciate her. We have other employees that just don't happen to be here today because of our event tomorrow. We kind of have to split up. So I'd like to also thank Mr. Brett Kirchner, who's in the back room, who's filming this for us. Doesn't charge us anything. He's a great partner with us. And he is the director of Channel 19 out of, it's a Comcast channel out of Hamtramck, and we're doing marvelous things, informing the community, and a really nice partnership that we have with the Hamtramck Library. So we're real proud of that relationship. So that's my introductions, and I hope I didn't miss anyone out there. And I don't think I missed anybody, so we're all good. But Magosha Tulaki is going to introduce our speaker.
I'll step up to the microphone to make this a little bit easier. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just one more thing. So if you bought a book, please, Dominik will be here to sign it, so feel free.
Feel free to form a line afterwards. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. As you may have heard, my name is Małgorzata Tulaki. I am the Executive Director at the Piast Institute, and I'd like to introduce to you tonight our speaker, Dr. Dominik Stecula. Dr. Stecula holds his doctorate in political science from the University of British Columbia and is an associate professor of political science at Colorado State University. He also serves as a chair on the board of directors of the Piast Institute. His 2010 book, as you may have heard, Polish Americans Today, Modern Polonian Leadership, was written jointly with the late Thaddeus C. Radulowski, the co-founder of the Piast Institute. Building on that project, the second edition of the book, Polish Americans Today, was published in 2021 solely by Dr. Stecula. Both editions were published by the Institute and were based on a national survey, one that you may see the logo of in the corner here, the Polish American Study, which was a large national survey across the United States. This second edition offers more detailed data on the Polish American community, and it paints a comprehensive picture of the American Polonia and focus on the attitudes, demographics, identities, cultural activities of the Polish American community. Now, if you can help me welcome Dr. Stecula up to the stage, we can begin the program. The podium.
Is this for me?
This is a microphone for Channel 19.
So I have to put it up? Okay. Good to see you. So I didn't realize I have a mic.
Does the microphone have to be on? Oh, he said it is already on.
Okay. All right. I'll put it up because I'll probably walk around. I like to wander. Thank you for having me. Just kidding. I'm going to disrobe. Thank you for having me. So nice to see faces I don't know, faces I know. I don't know which ones are more intimidating. It's good to see the people when they hear me speak, even the people that are friends and family. So it's encouraging. So today I'm going to talk to you about our study. We're going to talk about a lot of the studies we've done with Dr. Radulowski. This is like a culmination of the work that we've done with the Institute that started back in 2008. The title of today is Pride, Heritage, Food. That actually comes from the open-ended responses to the survey, which we'll talk about in more detail in a second. But that just kind of shows you what people are thinking about when they're thinking about kind of their association with the Polish American community. And for those of you who don't know, the picture there on the cover says two homelands, one heart, dwie ojczyzny, jedno serce, which is something that kind of a lot of Polish Americans feel right? Like you kind of have commitments to two different places with one heart. I am, as Małgosia said, a professor of political science at Colorado State, and for the longest time I used to kind of think of the Piast work that I've done as like a separate thing from like the other stuff that I do, which is mostly about American politics and kind of information consumption and stuff. But over time this has become one of the focuses of my work, the kind of the idea of an identity and how that shapes kind of who you are, what you believe, politically and not politically. So, this is personal for me because, as you can see from a poorly scaled photograph here, this is like the very first photo of me, my brother, and my mom. My mom's here, actually, there she is. So this is the first time, yes. So this is us in August of 2000 at Chicago O'Hare. First photo in American soil. Let me tell you, it wasn't easy. It was very hot that day. You know, it was a hard time. The first few, let's say, several decades were pretty difficult. You know, without this decision, none of this would be happening, obviously. But also, this kind of highlights how this is like a part of my personal experience here. Right? Like this isn't just like an academic interest in some community. This is something that has been informed by my lived experience. I know several people in this room who have also shared some of this experience. And that's kind of the motivating factor behind a lot of this stuff. So, you know, we came to this country in 2000. Went to high school in Dearborn Heights, Crestwood High. And people would pick up on the fact that I didn't speak English very well. They would ask where you're from, right? You would say Poland. And then people would say, oh, you're Polish, I'm also Polish. And then I would get excited. I was like, that's awesome. And then very immediately it became clear that what they meant was that they're Polish American, right? They didn't speak Polish. They didn't really know much about Poland. And that is something that I always wondered about, right? Like, so why is this person saying that they're Polish, right? Why are there Polish Americans who don't speak Polish? How can you be Polish if you haven't been to Poland? Things like that were things that I've been wondering about, right? And kind of what connects me to somebody who's a 4th, 5th, 6th generation, somebody living in Hamtramck or Warren or Sterling Heights or Redford or wherever. So those are the things that really kind of were confusing to me, kind of personally, from the early days. Lots of people I met would say that they're Polish, but very few of them would actually kind of be Polish in a way that I would understand that, right? So, you know, things happened, right? Like I went to high school, was working at this restaurant in Southfield, and then there was an ad in, I think it was Polish Times, it might have been Polish Weekly, might have been both, I don't know. And the ad was for a job at a Piast Institute. That was in 2006. Back then, Piast was on Kniff, and next to Paycheck's Lounge. Shout out to Mr. Paycheck. I remember going in, talking to Dr. Radziłowski, talking to Virginia, and I got a job. And that was very cool because up until that point, I didn't realize that, I mean, that definitely was better than bussing tables at a restaurant. But I didn't realize that, you know, doing this kind of stuff could be like a job that one could have, right? So being able to kind of have Dr. Radziłowski's mentorship and kind of see him, obviously he was a very renowned historian, but also just a very prominent member of this community, somebody who just did so many interesting things. And that really was like transformational for me because this became like a thing that really changed my mind about like what I could do with some of the things that we were doing at Piast, and kind of that became a kind of viable way for me to kind of see maybe an academic career down the road. It probably wouldn't have happened without Dr. Radziłowski. There's Dr. Stockton here in the room, who's also played a very, very important part in that development of kind of my career there. But it is really that, and that location specifically, that really kind of changed things for me. One day somebody slammed into this corner of the building, and the building shook, and it was very scary and very weird, but I'm just glad we're in the Puronic Studios now. Yes.
We did not have record graveyard.
Yes, that photo is somewhat deceiving. There were very little vinyls inside of Piast Institute when we were there. So today we're going to talk about just like the genesis of the Polish-American studies. There have been more than one. We'll talk about the 2020 edition. We'll talk a bit about Polonia and Michigan, and then hopefully we have some time for Q&A. So this is me and Dr. Youngbloods back in 2009. We are presenting some work in Chicago at the PAC conference. And back then, I joined Piast in 2006. That was also the year when Piast became a census information center. We were the only census information center in Michigan. And that was the time, and also I played no role in that, right? There was Dr. in Virginia doing their magic. I didn't bring the Census Information Center to Piast. But I definitely benefited from that, because we were all of a sudden playing around with census data, working with the Detroit field office of the US Census Bureau, and putting together reports for various community members, not just Polish, other ethnic groups in Hamtramck and beyond. Yeah, so that was fun. We went to DC, and that was something that really kind of opened like a whole new world of data to us in the Institute. But as we were playing around with census data, it became very clear that census data only gives you so much stuff. Right, so census is like very high quality data. I mean, the census that takes place every 10 years is meant to count everybody, right? It is a census, it's not a sample. But it doesn't give you much, right? It gives you kind of the basic demographics, gender, education, how long is your commute, right? Your educational attainment. These things are very useful. But the moment you want to know more, right, you want to know about religion, identity, politics, consumer behavior, you won't get it from the census. Now, it used to be the case that Polish Americans were surveyed by other groups. But that stopped being the case more recently. So the National Opinion Research Center, NORC, at the University of Chicago, they used to sample ancestry groups, including a sample of Polish Americans. They stopped doing that about early 1980s. And we were essentially, on most major surveys, just relegated to just the category white. Right, so it's fine, right? It's a perfectly fine category, but it includes a lot of people that are different from each other, right? Like German Americans are white, Irish Americans are white, Arab Americans are white, Cuban Americans identify as white, right? There's a lot of whites around, and a lot of them are different from each other. So we didn't really know all that much about Polonia specifically. And there was a need, we felt, there was a need that needed to kind of be addressed, which is that, you know, we needed more information about the community that we didn't have, ultimately for our own sake, ultimately to kind of develop better understanding of our community for Americans as a whole, for Poles, because, you know, on the one hand, you still have things like the Polish jokes, right? You have some kinds of discrimination that people of Polish descent occasionally experience in the United States. But then on the other hand, you also have negative attitudes towards Polish Americans coming from Poland, right? Like there's this idea that people are kind of Polish in name only. There's a lot of unpleasant stereotypes associated with Polish Americans. So we felt like building this understanding would help to kind of better understand our community, not just for our own sake, but also for Americans and for Poles. So, doing a random nationally representative survey of Polonia was a fantasy, and more or less remains so, right? So like in my kind of day job, I do a lot of surveys, do a few every year, and it is very expensive to survey people, right? Like it's very costly. People might not realize this, but just to give you an idea, when I was at the University of Pennsylvania, we were doing a study. We needed about 5 to 7 minutes of survey time. The survey was done over the phone. So it was random digit dialing, nationally representative, about 1,000 people. Usually when you sample American public, you want about 1,000 people. That's a sweet spot. So 1,000 people, nationally representative, 5 to 7 minutes. Any guesses in terms of how much does that cost? So that costs $35,000, right? So 7 minutes of survey time for 1,000 people. Now, why does it cost that much? It costs that much because response rates are very low, right? So when somebody in some office, you're working with a survey firm, they have a call center, somebody in some office is sitting there, it takes them about an hour of calling to get one response, right? So when you try to scale that, it becomes very financially exhaustive. You can do online, but online makes it harder to kind of really get a nationally representative sample. So there's no easy kind of way around that. Right, so it's hard to get like a full-blown kind of the study of Polish Americans, nationally representative, random study. It would require a lot of people to be surveyed, and it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we couldn't do that. So we did the next best thing. That's called snowball sampling, essentially leveraging the community. Right, this is something that people do in order to reach kind of harder to reach populations, right? You leverage the community. So what that entails is using emailing lists that we at the Institute have built over the years, utilizing social media, word of mouth, getting people involved, right? Like we did this past time, we did a lot of kind of interviews with Polish American outlets in Chicago and New York and Boston. Essentially, a lot of people doing a lot of work to make people aware that this is happening and encouraging people to participate. Is it perfect? No, but it is difficult to do, right? Like Polish Americans don't live in one place. We're spread out all over the country, and it is very logistically difficult to do this. So that's what we did. So the first study we ran, it was in the fall of 2008. I don't know if you remember, there was an election. There was this young whippersnapper, Barack Obama. He was running against John McCain. Fall of 2008, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland reaches out to the Piast Institute, and they are interested in political participation patterns of Polish Americans. So doctor calls me to his office, we kind of start planning what we can do, and there's a lot of publicly available data, right? There's kind of voting records, etc., census data we can use. So we're kind of mapping what we can do, but it becomes clear that it would be cool if we could just do our own survey. And so we did. So that was the first survey I ran. I'm pretty sure that was the first survey that Dr. Ajłowski ran. I mean, he was a historian, so I don't think he ran very many surveys. We did our best, and it was pretty good. 876 responses, 39 states plus DC, and we're hooked. So that generated this report that went out to MSZ in Poland. And we figured like, okay, we can, if we got almost 1,000 people, let's just do it again. We'll ask more questions, and like, it's gonna be awesome. So we started drafting more extensive survey, which we ran the following year. We got almost 1,400 respondents from 42 states plus Washington, D.C. And that resulted in this book. The site, like here's one of the original copies. So we wrote the results of that out with Dr. Radziłowski, and that was very popular. So we found that we kind of struck gold in a sense. We sold out of the first printing. There was a second printing. So the first one was in 2010. There was a second printing in 2011. Third printing, updated with some newer census data, that was released in 2012. Those things went out to the Presidential Chancery of the Republic of Poland. They bought several copies for the marshals of the Sejm and Senate in Poland. They went out to the Prime Minister's office at the time. Major Polish universities got copies. CEBOS, which is a major Polish public opinion agency, got a few copies. University of Warsaw runs a Center for Migration Studies. They got some copies. There was really a lot of interest. I remember Doctor went on like a little tour. There were several conferences that took place in Detroit, Chicago, Traverse City, Cleveland, New York, DC. So a lot of people are really interested in this. So very much we wanted to continue this work. So we did. At that time, I kind of left to do my graduate studies. In 2013, I was already doing my PhD, and we figured we might as well run another study, which we did. That one had a sample of over 1,300 people, 46 states plus DC. That one resulted in the middle thing, which is a Decabon report, which you can still find online. And we did a Decabon lecture, which is a big lecture that Piast does, that Dr. Radziłowski delivered, I think in 2013 or 2014. So the intention was always to kind of come back and kind of keep doing this. And we didn't have a chance to. So I was doing my PhD. Doctor passed away. We always wanted to continue doing this, but it definitely got placed on the back burner up until 2020, when there was really a lot of conversation thinking back to, we should be able to do this. 2020, good year, election year, lots of interest. We always found that election years triggers a lot of interest in these things. There's not a lot of data on Polish Americans. Whenever any candidate visits Poland, in 2012, Mitt Romney went to Poland. New York Times wrote about our data because it was the only data that was around. So we figured, why not do it again? People at Piast, Małgosia, Virginia, everybody affiliated with Piast was working very hard. And that was the biggest study we were able to run to date. So we almost had 1,800 people in 42 states plus DC at the time. Now the hope is to continue doing this. Nobody else seems to want to, so why not us? It is not easy. Begging people to answer a 30-minute survey is not easy. But people do it for some reason, and I think they do it because they find that it provides useful information for the community. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of kind of how all of this came about. So now let's just dig into some of the findings. So before we do that, let's start with kind of what Polonia is. And here, I'm just going to rely on kind of what Dr. Radziłowski always would talk about and write about. Because Polonia is essentially Polish America. And to him, it always meant that this is a modern American ethnic group, right? We have strong, abiding ties to Poland, but we also have a long and distinctive American experience. Right? So Polonia is not just like a thing that happened at some point and it just stays the same. It's a dynamic entity, right? Polonia kind of was founded a long time ago, and it has continued to evolve in response to new immigrants and challenges from Europe and Poland, as well as to an ever-changing kind of American environment, which Polonia itself shaped over the years. So again, the idea is that Polonia isn't set in stone. Polonia is a living, breathing thing. It has its own internal dynamics. I know a lot of you are active in all kinds of organizations. You know what I'm talking about, right? Like, there's a lot of internal dynamics, let's say. But Polonia also continues to reinvent itself, right? It continues to be a new creation. And for Dr. Radziłowski, it was always important to for people to realize that, this is a thing that changes. It changes in light of who comes from Poland, in terms of developments that happen here. And it is important to do studies like this in order to know how the community changes, what are people responding to, etc. So let's start with basic demographics. So we are part of the Big Five, right? So when you think about the Census Bureau, right, there's the racial categories: white, black, Asian, Pacific Islander, etc. So on that, most people who are Polish American choose white, but not all. Right? There's only one ethnicity as far as the Census Bureau is concerned, that is Hispanic/Latino, right? So you can either be Hispanic Latino or you don't have an ethnic affiliation. Why? Don't ask me, I didn't come up with those. But there are ancestries, right? So when we talk about different ethnic groups that we're talking about here, we're talking about ancestries, right? And when you fill out a survey from the Census Bureau, you can choose up to 2 ancestries. And there are about 9 million people who pick Polish as one of those 2, right? And that makes us the 5th biggest one after German, English, Irish, and Italian. So that's about 3% of the population, right? Is it huge? No, but it is a lot of people. So to give you an idea, it's about 9 times as many as Ukrainian Americans. But also, there's about twice as many Italian Americans as there are Polish Americans, and there are about 3 times as many Irish Americans as there are Polish Americans. So we're up there. We're not the biggest, but we're by no means the smallest. As I mentioned earlier, this is where we live. And it becomes very clear that most Polish people don't live where I live, which is in one of the rectangle states of Colorado. Right? Not a lot of purple action there. I mean, we do okay. We have a Polish store, right? There's always kielbasa, but not a lot more. Most people, as you can see, Midwest, Northeast, right? Illinois, New York, 2 biggest ones. Just under 1 million, right? About 900,000 or so. Those are the biggest, and then you have Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, New Jersey, right? So very much Midwest, Northeast. Very different communities though, right? Very different communities because, for example, right, in Illinois, almost 1 in 5 Polish Americans speak Polish, right? So it very much is an immigrant community. In New York, it's a little smaller, but it's still about 12%. All the other states, less than 4%, right? So Michigan, Wisconsin, that's a fun one. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, a lot less Polish speakers. So different kinds of communities, right? Born in the US, Polish American versus immigrant communities. In terms of specific metro areas, again, you probably guessed Chicago, New York City, biggest ones. And then it's Detroit, Philly, Pittsburgh, Buffalo. So again, some of the Rust Belt cities, Midwest, Northeast. Now you can also make a claim that we are, to some extent, multi-ethnic. So we have about 1 in 5 respondents declare affiliation with another ethnic group, right? So for a lot of people, especially those born in the United States, the Polish part shares the identity with some of the other groups. This is just a word cloud of some of the most common responses. Obviously, the bigger the word, the more commonly it gets mentioned. So a lot of people declare being Polish American, but also German American, Irish American, Italian American. I mean, we have Africa and Croatia mentioned for some reason, Dutch, right, Britain, Sweden. So people have complex identities. And it is important to know that, again, if you're born in Poland, you're just Polish, right? Only 2% of those people have other commitments. But for the for the American-born Polonia, it does look more complex. So let's talk about some stereotypes. So if you've seen Gran Torino, right? Here's a quote from Gran Torino. Polish jokes, not fun. Still can make fun of Polish people, right? Other ethnic groups, less so. But where do these come from? Well, we were kind of one of the bigger groups to arrive in such numbers, in such large numbers, so late, right? So some of the other groups in the Big Five came between 16th and 18th century. A lot of Polish people came a little later. A lot of bad stuff happening, if you're not familiar with, right? Like not good things happening in Poland at the time. Yes?
Is that a Clint Eastwood movie?
Yes, that is a Clint Eastwood movie, yes. He's Walt in this one. And, you know, a lot of bad things are happening. People are arriving, mostly forced migration, right? Forced migration doesn't mean you have time to kind of learn the language necessarily, right? So people kind of come, they become blue-collar workers regardless of their occupation back home. Frequently unwilling to assimilate into the new neighborhoods, kind of showing deep commitment to Polish language, culture, and customs. That didn't play well with the host country. Part of it is also like a more or less active propaganda effort that's rooted in what Otto von Bismarck did, Kulturkampf policy, right? The idea trying to paint Poles, all Poles, as essentially, you know, dumb Pole who can only work the fields, right? That was something that the Germans were doing frequently, and that's something that really, really stuck. So lots of kind of negative stereotypes. Here's a quote that I'm not going to read in its entirety because the moment I read long passages publicly, I make mistakes, so I'll let you read this. This is from Agaton Giller, who's a Polish historian and revolutionary. But he talks about kind of how people became Polish, right? And the second part of the quote is really interesting here, right? National consciousness originates in him spontaneously in a foreign country in consequence of the feeling of the striking difference between his speech, his customs, his conceptions from those of the people who surround him, right? So it was a difficult time for a lot of people, but these ideas, these stereotypes of dumb Poles were prevalent and continue to some extent to be prevalent. So here's some actual data, right? So just over 30% of Americans have at least a 4-year college degree. So 4-year degree or more, right? Professional degrees count here. So if you're a lawyer, right? If you're have a PhD, if you're a medical doctor, just north of 30% of Americans have 4-year degree or higher. Among people with Polish ancestry, that's about 10 percentage points higher. And obviously the sample that we got is overwhelmingly more educated, right? But definitely the stereotype doesn't necessarily hold. Yet the discrimination very much still sticks. So majority of respondents to our survey indicated that they have personally experienced discrimination due to their ethnic origin. Mostly it's the kind of Gran Torino stuff, insensitive humor about name or ethnicity, offensive stereotypical remarks, general feelings of being treated differently than others. So there's this general kind of vibe that people are just not being treated like as well as others, and people would pinpoint stereotypes in popular culture, right? If you watch like SNL or some movies, right? There's definitely still an occasional joke in there, and also historical inaccuracies. So, for example, talking about Polish death camps during World War II, right? So that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. Although that stuff might be changing. So this is a tweet from a few days ago from Noah Smith. Noah is a reporter for Bloomberg News. And he reflects on something that I think a lot of people have been noticing, which is that, you know, you kind of go to Silicon Valley, you go to some of these kind of high-tech hubs in the country, and there's a lot of Polish people who work there, right? And they're doing great. And the Polish jokes that Noah experienced at the party didn't really land because the stereotype just wasn't there. So maybe there's some change happening, right? It was always kind of a bit off. It was always, the origin of it is important to recognize, and the kind of educational attainment shows that like there wasn't much truth to this, to these kind of stuff to begin with, but this is something that maybe is changing in popular culture. Now, another set of findings that are intriguing have to do with religion, right? So there is this idea of kind of Polak Catholic, right? This is the kind of, we're devout Catholics, and obviously some people are, but it's a little more complex than maybe the perspective that you had coming in would lead you to believe, right? So we have overwhelming majority of respondents who identify as Catholic. 6% identify as Polish National Catholic, just as a side note. That is significantly lower than people identifying as Catholic in Poland, which clocks in usually at about 90%, depending on the study. Importantly, for Catholics, about 43% said that their religion is very important to them, which is considerably lower than American Catholics more generally, right? So this data comes from Pew Research Center. They do like a big survey of religion in the US once every few years. And that number is lower. And in fact, also 1 in 5 of Polish Catholics indicated that religion is not important to them at all, which is about twice as high as that figure for like American Catholics in general. So maybe less devout than the stereotype would lead you to believe. Now, church and Catholicism continue to be very important, right? So when you ask people about the religious attendance, most people say they don't go never, but they don't go every week, right? So you kind of go at some point of in between, some irregular church attendance. But people who go frequently go to either a Polish church or go to a church with a Polish priest. And for Polish-born people, it is majority of the people who attend either a Polish church or a church with a Polish priest. So that shows you that it's still a very important part of the community, especially the immigrant community. Churches are still hubs for that activity. So maybe less devout than you would believe based on a stereotype, but still an important institution within the community. Okay, another stereotype, and that one's kind of coming from Poland, right? So if you ask Polish people about Polish Americans, right, they would say like, oh, they can't even point to Poland on a map. So I was always intrigued by that, so I flat out asked, we just flat out asked people. Now we showed them a different map than this. You could point to Poland on this map pretty easily. This is not much of a challenge. We showed them a different map. Nothing was labeled. So people saw a map of Europe. 92% could point to Poland on a map. So I'm happy to report people can point to Poland on a map. About 13% of American-born respondents couldn't. So we can improve, right? There's about 1 in 10 who can't point to Poland on a map. Most people also knew that Warsaw was the capital city. But kind of hilariously, 1% of respondents born in Poland, and that's more than one person, that's a handful of people, also couldn't point to Poland on a map. So, you know, what can you do? That one was rough. We also asked about some other stuff. We showed them a different photo of Lech Wałęsa. This one says Solidarność on it, so you kind of can maybe work it out. The one we showed them didn't say Solidarity on it. Most people overwhelmingly could identify Lech Wałęsa based on a photo. So knowledge of like Polish stuff was pretty high. Knowledge of Polish American stuff, less so, right? Only about half of the respondents knew that October was Polish Heritage Month. 35% knew that there was about 10 million people with Polish ancestry in the US. So we have some work to do on that front, but it's definitely better than you would think based on the stereotype. So let's talk about the identity stuff. What does it mean to be Polish American? So, and I'm borrowing here from some of the writings from Dr. Radziłowski. Polish Americans kind of became Polish and American simultaneously. Often people here became consciously Polish before their relatives in Europe acquired modern Polish identity. So it was an important part, right? They were like in Polish hubs, Polish community here, and they became Polish here earlier than some of the people they left behind back home before they acquired the kind of Polish identity. And for this group, the concern was primarily kind of building up the institutions of the new community, right? So kind of institutions that would kind of allow the group to thrive as an American ethnic group. So there's different labels that people use. Polish American is the one that's kind of the label of choice for a lot of people. It's the kind of unifying one too. Polish Americans are how a lot of Polish-born people talk about themselves, but it's also how a lot of American-born people talk about themselves. American of Polish descent is a label of choice primarily for people born in the US, right? You kind of put American first. And for a lot of people born in Poland, Polish is the label of choice. But the Polish American one is unifying in a lot of ways. You know, people are proud of their attachments. So there is a lot of pride in being a member of this community. And interestingly, there is more emotional ties to Poland than to Polonia. And that includes American-born respondents. In other words, people are more attached to this vague conception of Poland than to the community kind of on the ground here. And which will become a theme over the rest of this talk. About 1 in 3 Polish-born respondents have very little to no attachment to Polonia, which is something we probably could work on. Now, importantly, we threw a bunch of identities at people. So we offered kind of class-based identities, political identities, religious identities. So what was important? Being Polish was important, being American was important, being Polish-American was important, being Catholic was important. Political identities were important to some people. The thing that wasn't at all important to people was being white, right? Like that wasn't an identity. So the group were all kind of jumbled into in a lot of surveys. That's not really an identity, right? Like unless you're a member of the clan, you're not like proud white, right? So it's important to kind of highlight white wasn't an identity. We also ask people and give them the opportunity to express in their own words like what comes to mind, right, when they think of Poland. So nothing is shocking here, I guess, right? You have some personal kind of stories, right? Childhood, father, grandparents, right? You have Catholic, religious, so there's a religion component, right? There's like component of kind of beautiful, there's Warsaw, there's Krakow, right? So culture, pride, ojczyzna. So all kinds of different things. Food, there's always pierogi, they are delicious, right? So all kinds of things, no surprises. We did the same thing for thinking about Polonia, and this one was a little more complex. So here we obviously have some positive words, right? Happy, dance, food, pride. But there's also some negative words that were affiliated with Polonia. So insular, divide, right? So definitely slightly different vibe than just thinking about Poland, which was more overwhelmingly positive. In 2013, we also asked people about the importance of kind of why is Polish American important to you? And again, some of the answers you can see on the screen here. Bigger the word, more frequently gets mentioned. Tells like a fairly kind of expected story, right? History, heritage, identity, family. And values. So, what are some of the values? Here, we relied on a lot of questions that Dr. Radziłowski crafted for the 2013 survey, and then we repeated those in a 2020 study. Now, the number one value has been family, right? So no matter kind of how many times we asked that in different years, family was the most important thing, right? That's the one that stood out. Always first. There was kind of 3 tiers. The second tier of values was things like commitment to freedom, the belief that Polish culture and history are unique, Polish work ethic. And then the kind of tier below that were things like honor, ethnic pride, sense of community, and Catholic faith. But regardless of how many times we asked that, in what year, family was always above all else. Dr. Radziłowski also crafted some questions about kind of key aspects of Polonia experience. And we gave people a lot of options, but the 2 things that always stood out were Kościuszko and Pułaski and their contributions to American independence, and Polish work ethic. All the other stuff was significantly below that. And it's not just us that are kind of obsessed with Kościuszko and Pułaski. So there was a study recently done that mapped essentially every single statue and monument in the United States. And there are more statues in this country of Pułaski than there are of Ben Franklin, Ulysses Grant, John F. Kennedy, Thomas Jefferson, and a few others, right? So it's not just us obsessed with Pułaski, like everybody's obsessed with Pułaski. And street names too, and bridges, right? So lots of Pułaski stuff. In terms of events and kind of time periods, Solidarność, still the one that gets mentioned the most. Warsaw Uprising, fight against Nazism, fight against communism, the kind of more vague Polish culture, arts, and literature, and then Pope John Paul II. Solidarity usually on top. Importantly, the ones that don't get as much recognition are kind of any ways in which kind of modern Polish culture can be anything about modern Poland doesn't really float to the top. So there is like a focus on the past in the community for sure. And in terms of kind of community life, we asked some really important questions that show that, again, building on one of the previous points that I made, Polish-born respondents don't really feel that they belong. A lot of the Polish-born respondents would be less likely to feel that they belong to the Polish-American community compared to American-born respondents. And when you kind of think of, belonging to a community, frequently that is expressed through belonging to different organizations. And majority of respondents in 2020, but also in 2013, and I believe in 2010 as well, did not belong to any Polonia organizations. So most people did not belong to organizations, and those born in Poland were less likely to belong than American-born Polonia. There is some hope in the sense that Polonia groups on social media is the activity through which a lot of people kind of felt that, acted on that need to belong. So about 73% of respondents did declare that they belong to some social media groups. And social media has become the most important way through which people kind of educate themselves about what's going on in a community, right? So it's kind of friends and family, and then it's social media. It's 3 times as many people use social media to learn about Polonia stuff than listen to Polish radio or like Polish American newspapers, etc. So social media is a key part of this, which is troubling because I don't know if you've been on social media, but it's pretty wild sometimes. So when we asked about people kind of why don't they belong, frequently they mention lack of organizations. And that is definitely the case. It might be hard to imagine lack of organizations when you're in Michigan, but believe me, when you're in Colorado or in southern states, there's a lot less kind of organizations to join. They cite lack of time, and some people lack of desire to join to begin with, right? But that is an important part of this. Another way in which you can kind of feel that connection is through visiting Poland. And most people did declare visiting Poland, including majority of American-born Polonia. And people, a lot of people, about a third, go fairly regularly, at least every other year or more often. So people do tend to kind of visit. A lot of people have friends, a lot of people have families, and they cultivate these connections. And then language is also important as well. So language is something that is really important. You know, people kind of lied on that one, because a lot of people said they have elementary knowledge of Polish, but like, come on, like, it's very elementary, right? So about 20% of the respondents say they don't know Polish at all, but that number was probably a little higher. But yet, despite this, a lot of people view kind of cultivating Polish language as an important part in a mission of the community, including people who don't speak Polish, right? So even people who don't speak Polish name preserving Polish language, Polish heritage in the US as like an important issue. It's something that people kept coming back to regardless of how we asked the question. Language and kind of cultural presence in the US was much more important than some other things. Right, so kind of language, culture, fighting historical revisionism, that's the Polish death camps. Political stuff, advocating for Polish immigrants, advocating for Polonia issues, much less interest in that. Right, what are Polish American issues? I don't know. Right, like there used to be, visa waiver was an issue a lot of people cared about, right? Ability for people to kind of come here without having to obtain a visa, which was very hard to get. But we're past that, right? With that one was accomplished. There's not a clear issue that a lot of people kind of would articulate as a Polish American issue. Back in the day, it was Polish statehood when Poland was partitioned. Well, we are a state now, we're a country, we're doing well. You know, that's not an issue. So people are less interested in these things and more interested in just preserving the language, which is important because even people, again, who don't speak Polish view that as an important part of the mission of the community. And it also showcases the need for this stuff, you know, in a place like Colorado, not a lot of ways in which you can kind of send your kid to a Polish language school, right? That doesn't exist. So a lot of, as people kind of spread out all over the country, that is part of this that we could probably kind of spend some time thinking about as a community. And then why not? Let's talk about politics, right? So, just kind of historically, because I think people forget, right? Like the stereotype is that we're very conservative. But if you think back to kind of political involvement of the community, it started about 1880s, and it very much articulated itself as a kind of belonging to the Democratic Party, because this was the party of Catholic immigrants, of workers, and those opposed to the prohibition. And first involvement in the unions came through the Polish chapters of the Knights of Labor in Chicago and Detroit and in Milwaukee. Now, there were some contrarians, right? So there were some influential members of the community who did become Republicans. Those were particularly leaders of the Polish National Alliance, Polish National Catholic Church, businessmen, anti-clericals and freethinkers, and Protestants and socialists. So that's a weird mix. But essentially, those people were driven by what they viewed as an overwhelming influence of Catholic clergy on Polish politics. So they wanted to counterbalance that, and the way they envisioned it is through kind of being active in Republican politics. So that just highlights that partisanship among Polonia was not really a function of internal struggles, was a function of internal struggles, right? It was a kind of internal politics of the community. It was not about any kind of deep political commitments or ideology or political philosophy, right? It was kind of about politics of the group. In local politics, ethnic loyalty often superseded party affiliation. In Buffalo, Polish people came out to vote overwhelmingly for a Republican who ran for mayor twice because they wanted a Polish mayor. That's despite the fact that they were Democrats, right? So that did happen. But historically, the party of choice for a lot of Polish Americans was the Democratic Party. In the 20s, in the 30s, essentially, Democratic Party membership became part of Polish American identity along with the Union membership. And really things started to change with World War II, Yalta Conference, right? FDR kind of seen as selling out Poland to Soviets, Uncle Joe, right? That was not very well received. And additionally, the Republican anti-communism was really appealing to a lot of people. So people in that time period began to switch affiliations. Polls did come out strong for Al Smith. Al Smith was the first presidential candidate who was kind of openly Catholic. So people came out to support him en masse. But that was kind of the last effort. So when you kind of look at major national elections, since the 30s, most went for Democrats except Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, and then W. Bush. So that brings us to today. We are not a voting bloc, right? Like this is partisanship of Polish Americans on the top panel. The bottom panel is ideology, right? Symbolic ideology, whether you feel like you're liberal or conservative. If you compare these numbers, the partisanship numbers, to Gallup data of just general American population, they're more or less the same, right? We have some Republicans, we have some Democrats. We have slightly more Democrats than Republicans, but we have people who are both conservative and liberal. We do stand out on one thing, and that is preference for independent candidates. So in 1980, Polish Americans came out in very strong numbers. About 12% of the Polish vote went for John Anderson, who was a third-party candidate. I bet you a lot of you don't even know John Anderson ran for president, but 12% of Americans voted for him. And since then, that's been a pretty constant theme of kind of Polish voting. There was like an attraction to the independent third-party vote. There was similar based on our study in 2016, less so of a case in 2020. But importantly, Polish Americans very much recognize there's a feeling that neither party takes Polonia seriously. Nobody really seems to be catering Polish American vote, probably because there isn't one, right? There's not a single bloc. Different communities vote as a bloc. It makes sense for political parties to try to approach them and win them over as a group. Polish Americans, there's a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans, and you don't need to do anything specific in order to bring them out. So why bother, right? The incentives just don't seem to be there for a lot of political parties, which makes sense why a lot of the more political efforts at kind of mobilizing Polish vote don't really work out. Interestingly, a lot of people recognize that they argue that a Republican Party is more aligned with Polonia values than the Democratic Party. Then we also asked some questions about participation. And participation, kind of in a more traditional political science sense, it's not just voting, right? It's things like signing a petition, donating to some political cause, volunteering for groups. Polonia participation tends to be lower than American public, and importantly, Polish-born participation is lower than American-born Polonia. So there's an issue there. There are some efforts to kind of mobilize people for specific causes. One was fighting historical revisionism, right? Polish death camps. There was like very successful campaigns that got people animated. People came out strong for trying to add Poland to the visa waiver program. But the baseline level of political participation of Polonia is pretty low. And then the last thing on politics is, since a lot of people in the community are Polish citizens as well, as a Polish citizen living abroad, you still get to vote in Polish elections. About half of respondents say they do. But it's important to recognize that only a small proportion of people in this country who hold Polish citizenship actually vote in Polish elections. So by all accounts, there's about 400,000 people who are Polish citizenship who live permanently in the US. But just as a more recent example, 2019 parliamentary elections, about 29,000 people voted in the US. Right, so that makes it about 7%. So most people, by a pretty huge margin, even if they have the right to vote in Polish elections, choose not to. So let's conclude by thinking about Michigan Polonia. So in terms of Michigan, right, Polish Americans are kind of all over the place, with the exception of kind of the middle part of the state. I guess we hate, like, I don't know, what's there, Lansing? Macomb County, right, big Polish hub, but also in the thumb, right, like all over the coast, up north. Lots of Polish people all over the state. So what's the deal with Michigan Polonia? Again, top 3 state, right, a lot of people, well over 800,000 people who identify as Polish. So that's about 8% of the state's population. So that is a top 3 Polish state in the country. And Metro Detroit is a top 3 metropolitan area in terms of Polish population in the country. It's almost 500,000 people, so a big chunk of Michigan Polonia does live in Metro Detroit, which encompasses part of Wayne County, Oakland County, and Macomb County. So who are we? Michigan Polonia is a little different. It is on average a little older. It is less well off than Polonia as a whole. More religious and more Catholic than Polonia on average. And union membership is still strong compared to Polonia on average, right? Like, I mean, that makes sense. We're in Michigan, right? There's a plant across the street from this library, right? So union membership, although on decline in the country, is still a big part of Michigan Polonia, especially compared to Polish people elsewhere. And it's much less of an immigrant community and more Polish American, right? So even kind of when we tap into the emotional ties, in Michigan, people have ties to the Polonia more so than to Poland, right? Which is one of the few places in the country where that happens. And also, you know, they're less likely to identify as Polish purely, right? We choose Polish American or American of Polish descent here. Less likely to visit Poland and all the other downstream effects of that. So, just summing up, this is a complex group of people, right? A lot of the stereotypes are either flat out wrong or outdated. There are big differences between Polish-born and American-born Polonia, but also a surprising amount of kind of shared experience, common ground, overlap of interest, goals, and commitments, which is an important part of this community. And importantly, right, we're not a voting bloc, right? We have Republicans, we have Democrats, but Polonia doesn't really vote as a bloc. And there's less interest in some of the political involvement and more interest in kind of cultural preservation and language education, etc. I'm going to borrow for the next few slides from Dr. Radziłowski. We prepared some remarks for Kvovadi's conference, which is a conference for kind of young Polonia back in the day. And Doctor was talking a lot about the need for new organizations and renewed organizations, because he thought that a lot of the existing Polish American organizations were not able to kind of project Polonia's influence in the public sphere. Important part here is that you have to maintain communities, right? It's not about bolstering individuals, right? The key kind of quote I highlighted, vital traditions exist in communities, not individuals, right? People, like all of this boils down to being a community, not just a bunch of individual people with individual preferences. And there's no community without a shared story, right? Part of why we've been doing these studies and part of why it's important to try to understand kind of who Polish people are, who Polonia is, who Polish Americans are, is so that we have a community, right? So there's an understanding of what that shared story is, what is that shared experience, etc. Without that, it's hard to have a community, right? If people have different experiences, there's no shared story, it's difficult to foster a sense of community. And then lastly, and that's more of a personal reflection, you know, when we came to this country, even though it wasn't that long ago, I mean, it was 23 years ago, it was still a very different world in the sense that, like, we needed to go out to Hamtramck when Polish market was still there. We would buy calling cards because otherwise you would need to, like, sell your kidneys and liver and other stuff to, like, cover international phone calls. So you'd buy calling cards, right? You would get, like, 2-week-old magazines, right? It's a very different story now, right? Like, I FaceTime with my grandma today in Poland. Right? Like, it is very easy for you, if you want to live more or less exactly how you would have lived in Poland, right? You can subscribe to a Polish daily newspaper on your phone, you can listen to Polish radio, you don't need Polish American radio, right? You have Polish radio from Poland. It's easy, right? You have Polish TV, you can, through satellite or through less legal means, right? You can acquire Polish TV. It's easy, it's not expensive. Right? So it's easy to kind of just have that connection now without making an effort here, right? And build a community here. And that's the hard part now, right? Because it used to be the hub for kind of, that's how Polonia would kind of foster, right? And develop. People would go to the Polish store, right? They would read a Polish American newspaper. Now it's easy to kind of totally sidestep it and have a connection with back to Poland. And that makes things harder. So we have to think hard about kind of what do we do in this age of kind of connectedness and being able to kind of instantly access all these things back home. All right, so I'll stop here. I'm just going to say one thing. If you want the slides, you can scan the code and the PDF is there. And if you're interested in any of this stuff, I definitely encourage you to check out the Piast Institute. Piast has been around for 20 years, which is crazy because I've been there for a lot of those years, which is just wild. I'm very old. You know, if this is something that is in any way interesting or relevant to you, I definitely want to encourage you to kind of visit the website and get involved and support what the Piast does, because Piast is the only organization that has been gathering any kind of data like this. Nobody else does this. Thanks.
Dominik?
Yeah.
So before we go to questions and answers, Q&A, I just wanted to thank Oksana. She's in the room. Oksana, please stand up. And so,
Thank you.
Oksana and the Warren Library has really welcomed us and supported us with a new partnership that has worked out really well for us. And we appreciate your support and the ease in which you've made it possible to work with you. So thank you to yourself and to the library. We really appreciate it. I'd also like to say that I'd like to thank, in particular, the Consulate of Poland in Chicago for sponsoring this lecture exclusively. They were our main support. As you can imagine, people like this information, but they don't always want to support it. And so having the support of the consulate in Chicago really gives it, you know, a different feel for us, and should be for you, that they think we're worthy of their financial support and other support as well. So we have a good relationship with them, and I don't believe there's a representative here tonight. And we just want them to know, they're going to see this, we want them to know how much we appreciate them. We appreciate all of you for your interest, for coming out, and look forward to other lectures that we plan on having. I know Fran is going to be putting together a Decabon lecture here soon. So, excuse me, I believe, Michelle, on the sign-in, is there emails, contact? So we will definitely inform you of that. So now we welcome you to have open discussion with Dominik, and thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for
and
sharing.
I lived all this, but Magosh and I were both saying it's really nice to revisit it,
Yeah.
and we were part of it, but it's just nice to hear it again. And again, the thanks really does go out to Dr. Thaddeus Rejwowski. And I know we say his name a lot, and we mention him a lot. For those of you who don't know him, he was an amazing, amazing man. And of the 15 years that he was with the Institute, he never took a penny. He was never paid for any of his work, anything he ever did for 15 years. Actually, he kept us alive and supported us. And he wasn't a wealthy man, but this was so important to him to keep the history of Poland and Polonia alive. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Is there anyone that has a question for Dr. Stecula?
Yes. There's one question before Dr. Stockton. Yes.
Was someone ahead of me? Go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious when you were talking about being able to vote in Polish elections.
Yeah.
Very proud to say I got my Polish passport last year.
Congratulations.
And I did not realize that that could be part of the deal of getting my Polish citizenship confirmed.
Yeah. Yes, you get to vote. I don't know if it's still at the Polish American Center in Sterling Heights.
Okay.
You have to register to vote. You can go to I think we're under the Chicago consulate's kind of district. So you can, when the election comes up, you can register there, and then you would just vote either in person or through a mail ballot. I know last time it was during COVID, so it was mail-in ballot, but yeah. That's part of it, and they pretend you're in Warsaw for whatever reason. So
That's what I was
yeah,
going to ask. Is it the region?
it's some countries have like a kind of voting district for immigrants, for people abroad. Not Poland. Poland just lumps it in with Warsaw. So some people in Warsaw are upset, but who cares? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah, Dr. Stockton.
I noticed that Catholic identity is less than Catholics across the country.
Mm-hmm.
It was surprising.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to Poland, as you know, people adore John Paul,
Mm-hmm.
and they identify strongly with the church.
Mm-hmm.
But in the United States, there was a study done during the time of John Paul and asked, basically, how do you identify? Americans loved the man. Protestants loved him, Jews loved him, Muslims loved him, atheists loved him. The only deviation was among Catholics, where the split was basically 50-50. Half of Catholics loved John Paul in this country, and half did not like him. And that had to do primarily with the division between
Vatican
the
II.
conservative
Yeah.
thrust of John Paul and Cardinal Ratzinger, and the more progressive thrust of others. I wonder if within this country you saw any pattern of Polish identity which might have modified that generalized pattern among Catholics.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know what that would look like, but even in Poland, it's a little more complex these days now, right? So like church attendance has been dropping as well, and some of the things that happen in the Catholic Church, some of the abuse that happened has really kind of changed some of the perceptions, including of the Pope. So it's a more complex picture now than maybe it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago, but I'm sure some of it maps onto the more kind of progressive Vatican II versus conservative distinction. But we don't have any way to kind of pinpoint that in our data. Yeah. Yes.
Dominik, how do you define Polish Americans, Americans of Polish descent? Is it a percentage of Polish blood? If so, what percentage is required? Is that information based on self-reporting, or is some objective verification required?
No objective verification. I mean, if we have to do like genetic tests, that would be rough. I don't want to do that. So it's all self-declared, right? If you feel like you're Polish, then that's good enough for me, right? And in terms of which label, right? It kind of, we let people pick. So these are the three that really stood out, right? Some people just go with Polish. Those are mostly people born in Poland. Some people choose Polish American. This is a mix of American born and Polish born Polish Americans. And some people choose American of Polish descent, and that is primarily people born in the US. But that is all self-declared. It's entirely based on kind of how you feel and whether you feel like you belong to this group. Yeah, sure.
And Dominic, so with the census, one of the things, Piast Institute was selected as the, super site for the 2020 census, and I was the chair of that. And one of the things that was so interesting to most people was that the census, you could be purple, and if you want to declare you're purple, you declare it's all self. If you're black and you want to say you're white, they're okay with that, because it's not. It's really the freedom of your choice, how you see yourself and how you identify yourself. So that was amazing to people, because they were like, no, I'll get in trouble. It's like, no.
Yeah, nobody checks. Yeah.
There's no census police. And
The
so.
submitting of any document.
Yeah. And so, and again, I think this is interesting and maybe unrelated, but Hamtramck was the #1 city in the entire state of Michigan that had an increase, a dramatic, the highest increase in the whole state of Michigan for their census and their census count. We'd like to think that we had.
It's us, we did it. Yeah.
No, we do, because we worked really hard to get those numbers and encourage people to fill out the census report, and it made a difference. And as you all know, Detroit right now is in a lawsuit because, they didn't have a good count, and they know by electric bills, by that there are a lot of people who were counted in Detroit. So Hamtramck is counted very well.
Undercount matters a lot, not just for political representation, right? It matters for how many representatives you get in Congress, but it also matters for like allocation of federal funds, right? So like Detroit, by being undercounted, gets less money, right? And then
$5,800 a person.
Exactly. So that is a lot of money. And I think to what Virginia is saying too, right? Like especially in a community like Hamtramck, which is full of variety of immigrant groups, a lot of them coming from countries that are authoritarian, and the last thing you want to do is have a government official knock on your door and you're going to reveal your secrets to them, right? So that is a very important part of kind of working with groups to ensure that, like, yes, immigration is not going to find out about your status by you talking to a census taker, right? That is a hard part of trying to kind of reduce that undercount, because it's not about counting citizens, right? Like in the Constitution, it's just about counting people who live here, regardless of how they got here, right? And that's something that's done every 10 years for primarily political reasons, but that is a big part of the undercount. There's a political and monetary incentive, and a lot of Detroit is one of many cities that were severely undercounted, a lot of them in the Midwest, right? And that's not great.
The first one in 2010, and we built those trusts with the community. So when 2020 came, and we were chairs again, and we ran that census in Hamtramck, there was that trust factor that nothing happened to them in 2010, so maybe 2020 would be okay. And it was COVID, so it made it, so hard, but successful.
Definitely. Yes.
I just have a comment. growing up, being born in the 50s and growing up in the 60s in Detroit, I never identified, I didn't want to be identified as Polish because of the Polish jokes and that. But as I grew older and had a family, I still didn't really identify as being Polish because I didn't grow up having a Polish father, and then my mother didn't know anything about being Polish. She wasn't born here, or she wasn't born in Poland. So, but now having children, I enrolled them in Polish dancing, folk dancing, and that got me back in being proud to be Polish.
That's great. Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of stories like that, right? And a lot of like people kind of finding out about their roots through like 23andMe or Ancestry.com. So there's a lot of different mechanisms through which that can happen, but good for you. Yes.
I just wondered, in the mid-'70s and early '80s, my husband and I lived in Oklahoma, Texas. My husband's family is all Polish. His mother and father both spoke Polish. He went Polish dancing. We did everything. And when we lived there, we just couldn't get over how you talk about the Polish jokes. They had changed all the Polish jokes to being between Aggies and Okies. And we just...
They even stole the jokes. See? It's outrageous.
They were still telling the same old jokes, but they changed it to Aggies and Okies.
Yeah.
And then one time we went to the show and saw a movie by Burt Reynolds and Dom DeLuise. And it had a Polish character in it. And this man was, you know, not mentally okay, but he didn't hurt anybody or anything. But he declared himself being the Polish prince, and he wore his bowling shirt and all this other stuff. And there were maybe 6 people in the audience, and nobody laughed. Nobody understood what they were getting at. And my husband and I were just astounded because it was so different from where we came from. And so when we said that he was of Polish ethnicity, we were treated with respect and we didn't have any of that. The only thing sometimes where we were differentiated was because we were Catholic. Because we were in the middle of the Bible Belt. There was one Catholic church, and most people that were Catholic were people that came from up north. We were Yankees, which we'd never been called Yankees in our life. My family's all German, this was all Polish. We didn't, you know, this was strange to us. And our people all came after the 20s. And then we were categorized with the Mexicans and the Vietnamese boat people. It was just very strange. And so, I don't know, you know, we just acted like ourselves and we didn't fall into any of that stuff and nobody hurt our feelings. But it was just very different. I can remember as a child, I went to all parochial schools, even college. I went UD for my master's, everything. And I was always told, well, you might have to defend yourself and so forth. Never encountered it till I came to Oklahoma, Texas. And it was just really different how the people thought there. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
A lot of them. Thank you. Kuba?
Thank you. My comment is somewhat related to what she said, but I want to comment more specifically on more recent immigration from Poland, people our age or even younger. Maybe it's anecdotal, but they tend to be more educated. It's work-based, it's employment-based migration.
Because you came here, because you wanted to learn?
Exactly, it's voluntary.
Yeah.
It's to develop your career and pursue, opportunities within career sphere. But also the cultural aspect, that may not be initially their priority, the Polishness, the Polish Americanness, the food, the culture. But I think over time, there's this reverse reclaiming of Polishness. And again, it's maybe just anecdotal.
There is, I think there is.
The priorities may be different at first among those, more recent immigrants. However, I guess over time, they
You want to
reprioritize.
connect. You want to connect.
You want to connect, and you just start gravitating and placing more value on some of those concepts that were displayed in that cloud.
No, I think that's it, right? Like, I mean, I know a lot of people younger than us. I know how old you are. And yeah, like I know a guy who is Polish, was educated in Poland, was working for Facebook in Dublin for a long time, and now he works for Facebook in like the headquarters, right? And there wasn't a forced migration, right? Like he came because it was a career opportunity. And yeah, like he's not interested in finding Polish community in the Bay Area, right? He's Polish, he goes to Poland all the time. It's more about exploring the US right now, right? But maybe at some point, if he settles down, he has kids, etc., that becomes important, right? So I think there's definitely something to it, but you definitely feel, especially in some parts of the country, that is the key number of people who come, right? Those are like the newer immigrants, highly educated, mostly tech, other kind of high-paying industries, high-skilled jobs. Those are the people who come, right? So like Polish jokes and other stuff is just totally foreign to them because it's a different world, right? Like a lot of them were educated, some of them in Poland, some of them in other European countries. A lot of these people grew up in Poland under EU, where you can just freedom of movement. They would go to schools in other places. They speak languages very well because that's where they did their schooling, right? And it's just like a very different vibe than if you were forced to migrate for political or other reasons during a famine or other times in 19th or early 20th century, right? It's just a different experience. And other stuff around it will probably catch up over time. Yes?
A comment and a question. The year before COVID, I stopped at the Polish market in Troy on Fat Tuesday for punchkis.
Yeah.
And I asked the cashier, where were they from? I'm thinking Hamtramck, someplace locally. She said Chicago. Do you know how many people I've told that to that were totally amazing? And they're not as good, by the way, as
I am familiar because in Colorado we don't have a lot of choice, and you can order stuff from a Polish store in Chicago and they just ship it to you from Chicago. Yeah. Yeah.
And is there any way of really knowing how many Polish-born people, how many Polish-descent people are left in the city of Hamtramck? Last I heard it was like less than 15%, so I don't know if there's any way of knowing that.
It's 23%.
It's 23.
Yeah. So there is, I mean, assuming a census count, yeah, but it's, yeah.
And, you know, it's like anything else, you know, where somebody says something and then it just kind of spirals. There's a, you know, we feel like there's a great Polish presence. The Polish American Congress is there, we're there, the Polish Art Center's there, Shrubnik's there, you know, so there's still things there, and the people like Michelle's lived there her whole life. Stella lives there, is living there, and has lived her whole life. There's a lot of people, and we attribute, the doctor always spoke about that when the Polish people came to Hamtramck, they brought the front yard gardens, and so that's still there, and now the other ethnic groups are picking up on it. And
Hamtramck's always been an immigrant.
yeah, it's always been an immigrant city, but in a month, come to Hamtramck because you'll see the most awesome flowers you can imagine. The things that are happening in Hamtramck, there's literally mansions being built. They're taking those big two-story houses and building mansions around it. Redoing houses. The housing market for a house that not that long ago was $35,000 is now $235,000. And we gasp because, you know, Hamtramck was always, you know, you could get a good deal, living arrangements. It always was around $550, $650 for rent. It's $1,200 across the board now. So great things are happening in Hamtramck, and people, you know, will complain, well, it's not Polish anymore. We have the Polish Day, no, not the parade, because that's moved on. They're in war now. But
The 5K.
the 5K, which brings, I don't understand, these people
It's freezing.
run in the streets of Hamtramck with ice and snow, but at the end of the race, you get a punch cake and a beer. So that would be.
Are they familiar with stores? You can just buy them.
Yeah, I mean, and the yacht
They earned it.
races, you know, with the parade, and the parade has a huge, you know, component, St. Florian's Day Festival. I love, we still do, where the Polish Scouts and the firemen stand guard at the gravesite for Easter. So it's all there, but people like to talk and say things. It's pretty amazing, you know. I think it is. It's a great place.
There's probably less school-aged children that you would see, Polish that you would see in Hamtramck, and that's probably primarily the people that you see. A lot of the residents are older, have been in their homes for some time, and that information is available. We can go through census data as well, pick out different requirements, foreign-born, as you said, in a certain zip code. There's ways to break down that data if you look for it.
And Hamtramck, this is an amazing status. 83% of all the children in Hamtramck come from a two-parent household. Unheard of, not only in Michigan, but across the country. And there are other statistics.
And probably the most diverse place in America, really. 2.2 square miles, like more than 20 languages spoken in a high school, right?
Yeah.
Like that just doesn't happen. Yeah.
I'm surprised you didn't have a form for us to fill out so that we could have your own survey for tonight.
We have your contact.
Yeah. That's coming tomorrow. Yeah.
It would be interesting to see with just this small demographic here, but.
Yeah, and we love people to come and volunteer because there's so much work to be done, and I think we're the leading nonprofit organization in Hamtramck, well respected. People come to us of all. One of the things we're proud of is we don't just do Polish. Everyone is welcome at Piast. So, you know, we have so many activities that we could use all the volunteers. So if you're interested in finding out more about us, please give us a call, because we certainly have a lot of work.
Yes.
Is the name of the organization, Piast, is that a Polish word or is that an acronym?
It's one of the first like dynasties in Poland. So like when Poland was founded, right, there was the Piast dynasty was ruling it for a bit. Yeah.
So we have people say, oh, does that stand for like Polish, International?
I mean, it can. Sure it does. Why not? Yeah. Yeah.
We get that question all the time. It's a good one.
I have one more question, and that is, you mentioned a couple of times the Polish death camps, and I'm totally ignorant on that subject, and I will admit it. I don't know that there's a controversy.
So the controversy is that people in Poland get very upset when in Western media, not just US, oddly enough it happens in like German media too, people would describe Auschwitz and other death camps as Polish death camps, right? Whereas those are in fact Nazi death camps operated and set up by the German Nazi regime, right? So that is just the framing of this didn't sit well with a lot of people because it might lead people to believe that there were like Poles in charge of it, which wasn't the case. Millions of Poles died in these death camps as well. Yeah. Yes, Andy.
First of all, I'd like to commend Dr. Stecula and the Piast Institute for conducting this surveys. I don't mind pointing out that my wife and I and many of our friends and family members participated in the survey, so we're reflected somewhere in here.
Yeah.
All this data. And I found, as many of you have, many of the findings, which I read before, and it was good to see them again on the screen here, were counterintuitive in the sense that I didn't expect them. I was surprised by some of these findings. I'm sure some of you were too. But one of the one of the points early in Dr. Stecula's presentation made reference to the attitude of Poles in Poland today to Polish America and Polish Americans and Polonia and so on. And I can speak from recent experience. The last couple of years, I'm active in social media, and in particular on a Facebook group that's called I Love My Polish Heritage. So you can imagine what that's all about. A lot of but a significant number of members of that group, and the last time I looked, there were like 60,000 members, so it's a significant number. And an increasing number of those members in this Facebook group are obviously from Poland, currently in Poland, whereas when it started out, when I joined, it was like 4,000 members, and most of them were apparently Polish Americans, in America, Canada, a couple other places. And what I'm leading up to is that of the Poles that comment on that site and participate, there's a very clear sense of disdain and disparagement, if you will, and derision for Polish Americans. And then one of the questions you had in the outset was sort of a rhetorical question. You know, how can you be Polish, or how can you call yourself a Pole if you don't speak Polish? And I see that a lot. You know, it's this misconception about what Polish Americans are. People, and I'm thinking, not to stereotype, but since I'm of an age when I can stereotype, most of my sense are people in their 20s, maybe early 30s. Okay, and there's an arrogance, a chauvinism there that's reflected in some of the comments, including that one. You know, you call yourself Polish. Well, you can't even spell pierogi correctly because you put an S on the end of it. You know? And I'm fighting with them all the time because I like to fight. You probably waving my hands wrong. But I run into that a lot, and it's ironic that I want to be sure I use the right word. It's not that they're inimical or hostile to Polish Americans, but it's like we Polish Americans. I grew up in Polish and Polish American together. I mean, they're like three different entities. I resent that attitude. And they don't realize that there's a rich history of Polish Americans in the U.S. starting 160 years ago. And if you want to argue, even earlier in some cases. Have you heard, by the way, Christopher Columbus supposedly was Polish? Okay.
Yeah.
So what I'm getting at is you raised, or the study revealed some very interesting facts. And I would encourage you, those of you who like to fight like I do with people, buy one of our books and read it.
And he's recruiting an army for online trolls. I like it. No, that's great, and that's common in Polish popular culture, right? Like movies like Szczęśliwego Nowego Jorku, right? This idea that people who went, especially in the 80s, were just kind of laborers, right? People who would like get like an apartment in Brooklyn, in Greenpoint, or in Jackowo in Chicago, right? Like share like a 2-bunk bed, single room apartment between like 12 adult men working construction, right? It very much feeds to some of the origins of like the Polish jokes that really started in kind of German-occupied Poland at the time, right? Like it's really no different than that, but it's very negative. The perception of kind of who came is not positive, right? And it's still the case today, right? Yeah.
But Andy, I'm glad you brought that up because, so my generation, and you and I came from the same neighborhood. When I grew up, our parents didn't allow us to speak Polish outside the house. You could speak it in the house, but when you went outside, you couldn't because they didn't want us to be discriminated against. And it was every day you walked down the street and you were called a DP. Yep. And that was like being called the N-word to our parents, you know. And so it wasn't that we didn't want to speak Polish or, you know, whatever. We still went to Polish dance. We still went to Saturday school. We did all those things. We didn't do it outside of our community. So when we were out and about, they just didn't want us, I mean, they were protecting us. They weren't, and now we realize that they took something away from us, but at the time, that's what our parents wanted. That's what was dictated. And that's how, you know, I'm from Poletown, and so everybody was Polish. It wasn't like, you know, and it was difficult. It was.
We all have different experiences and different time periods when you came and what was going on in the world, because even with my experience, I felt like it was okay for me to say Polak. We're all Polacy, but what's a Polak? And I never realized negative kind of feeling toward it, because people would spell it like Polack, and it was very negative here for a lot of Polish Americans, and I know that you've had those experiences as well. And it wasn't until we had these kind of conversations and that we can bridge those gaps and to learn from each other what other people kind of went through, that I realized you had a completely different experience with that word alone versus what I would say as Pollack, P-O-L-A.
Oh yeah, I just thought they were just misspelling the word. I thought they were stupid. Yeah, the joke totally backfired. Yeah.
And I think that's why it's really important for multi-generations to speak to each other and to work together and to, communicate. So there's a huge age difference between Lubasha and myself. Well, I've learned from her and she's learned from me, and we've spent 15 years together, learning, and I think we're all better for it. So if you have an opportunity to, be with a younger person or be with an older person, listening to their stories, encouraging your kids to talk to Basha and learn those stories, everyone will be and pass those memories. Everyone will be much richer for it. Thank you, Dominik, very much.
Well,
and I just want to say that the library has been so kind to us, because many of you don't know they closed at 5 o'clock. So they have left this facility open for us. So if you want to get books signed or whatever, that's why we're stopping a few minutes over, so you get an opportunity to do that. Please, if you want some refreshments, please, help yourself. And then, thank you very much, and we hope you come
Thank you.
to the event.
Case, can you take a photo of me?